One of the biggest insights I had on my journey to increasing my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175 on test day came down to recognizing that it's not all about the type of question that you're dealing with on the LSAT, but rather it's about the method of reasoning in the stimulus or the passage. I found that far too many LSAT prep resources overcomplicated the LSAT with their trademarked terms, over categorizing LSAT question types, when in reality, if you actually took the time to understand the argument, to understand the method of reasoning, things became a whole lot easier. Surprise, surprise, if you actually take the time to understand what you're reasoning, things become a lot simpler. And so I found that I could help students break into the 170s by helping them translate an LSAT question from one type into another based on the method of reasoning in the stimulus. So for example, let's say you love flaw questions, but you hate weaken questions. With a little manipulation of the question stem and the stimulus, you can transform a type that you don't like into one that you do like, and it becomes a whole lot simpler to solve the question with just a little bit of manipulation. And if you understand the argument in depth, this kind of translation is actually pretty easy to do. You understand what's the conclusion, what's the evidence, what's the gap, what's the method of reasoning. This holds across roughly 3/4 of logical reasoning questions, since roughly 3/4 of them contain arguments rather than fact sets. This technique is just one of many that I cover with my students using the Socratic review method, where we help you understand the argument, understand the question, and understand the answer choices. Specifically, you want to understand what makes a wrong answer choice tempting for you and what ultimately makes it wrong. You want to understand what might have made a right answer choice seem unappealing and what ultimately makes it correct, because you have these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answer and traps of discouragement away from the right answer. And until you understand which tricks and traps you personally are uniquely prone to falling for, you run the risk of making those same mistakes again. And so at LSAT Unplugged, what we do for our students in our one-on-one coaching programs and our small group programs is we demonstrate the Socratic review method for you and with you live in our classes and our coaching. The classes are recorded for any students who can't make them live, and we have literally hundreds of them organized by topic and by difficulty level, since we've been doing this for several years, even since before the pandemic. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below this video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And the cool thing is, no matter what you're struggling with on the LSAT, this strategy works regardless of the question type that you're dealing with. Of course, sometimes you got to work on the basics before you even get into question types. And so you want to look at your conditional indicators, for example, for necessary and sufficient conditions. You want to look at your indicators for evidence and conclusions. This will carry you far. And of course, if you don't know them, you're in trouble. Now, I mentioned there are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, but some are more common than others. For example, you're going to have roughly 4 flaw questions per section of logical reasoning, and you might not even have a single evaluate the argument question. And so you want to focus on what are the most common types. They are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. Master those before you tackle the less common types that hardly ever show up. And of course, going forward, logical reasoning is doubled in importance since it's now 2/3 of the scored portions of the LSAT. Any gains you make there are going to be automatically doubled across those 2 sections of the test. So I'm going to share with you 3 quick wins for logical reasoning you can implement right away. You want to make sure that you are crystal clear on the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. I often find that after a student joins our program, we discover that if they were using one of the big corporate outlets like Kaplan, they were not clear on this difference, because some prep companies like Kaplan don't even distinguish between different types of so-called assumption questions. There is no such thing as assumption questions on the LSAT. There are necessary assumptions and sufficient assumptions, and they are asking for very different things. Necessary assumptions are far more common as well, so you want to make sure you're focusing on those to start with. You also want to make sure that you're clear on different types of inference questions, distinguishing must be true versus most strongly supported. Subtle, nuanced differences, incredibly important to make sure you're recognizing those distinctions, because the difference can help you get a question right, or it can make the difference in you potentially getting it wrong, which of course you don't want to do. The other thing you want to make sure you're aware of is that weakening an argument does not mean that you are necessarily destroying the argument. You are just making the conclusion relatively less likely given the evidence. Now, if you have already mastered the most common types of LSAT logical reasoning questions like necessary assumption, inference, and flaw, there are a couple of paths forward available to you. You can focus on the less common types of logical reasoning questions, or it may be that if you're scoring 165 or above, maybe you're not getting questions wrong because of the question stem type, but you're getting them wrong just because they contain harder methods of reasoning, and that's where that Socratic review method comes into play. You also want to make sure that you're clear on the more difficult methods of reasoning that may show up more frequently going forward now that logic games are no longer on the test. Based on early indications in experimental sections administered over the past several months, it seems that LSAC may increase the relative proportion of certain types of reasoning involving numbers and percentages, absolute versus relative values, and formal logic stimuli. If you'd like my help with those, again, you can check out the links below. We'd be glad to help. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.